color TV game. Before Mario, before Zelda, before any franchise you've ever heard of. Back in 1977, Nintendo made a box that played Pong, one game. At that point, Nintendo wasn't a gaming company. They were making playing cards with no experience in electronics and no real hardware infrastructure. The color TV game wasn't meant to dominate the market. It was practice, homework, a way to learn how hardware even works. It had built-in games, no plug-in games, no expansion. You played what was there, and that was it. Most people have never heard of it, and that's exactly the point. It quietly funded everything that came after. Nintendo Entertainment System. By 1983, the video game industry had completely collapsed. Retailers removed gaming shelves, Atari stock dropped 97%, and people genuinely believed home gaming was over. Then, in 1985, Nintendo entered that disaster with the NES. The Nintendo Entertainment System didn't just sell games, it rebuilt trust. The market had been flooded with low-quality titles, and Nintendo responded with strict quality control and the seal of quality, which told customers that a game was actually worth buying. That alone changed perception. Then came the games. Super Mario Bros., The Legend of Zelda, and Metroid didn't just succeed. They defined genres the industry still uses today. Yes, the hardware had issues. Cartridges failed, and everyone remembers blowing into them even though it didn't really help. But compared to what came before, it didn't matter. The NES reset gaming entirely. Game Boy. In 1989, Nintendo made a move that looked weaker on paper but dominated in reality. The Game Boy was technically inferior from day one. A monochrome screen, no backlight, and visible motion blur. Then Sega released the Game Gear, which looked far better in every store display. But the Game Gear needed 6 AA batteries and lasted only a few hours, while the Game Boy ran on 4 and lasted an entire weekend. That single difference decided the winner. Parents didn't care about color screens. They cared about not constantly buying batteries. The Game Boy was also incredibly durable. There is a unit that survived a bombing during the Gulf War and still works. Then, in 1996, Pokémon launched and turned the system into a global phenomenon. What started as a simple handheld became a permanent new category of gaming. Super Nintendo. In 1990 and 1991, Nintendo followed up with the Super Nintendo, and instead of reinventing everything, they refined it. Better graphics, better sound, smoother gameplay, but most importantly, better games. Titles like Super Mario World, A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, and Chrono Trigger pushed design, storytelling, and atmosphere forward. These weren't just popular games. They set new standards that still influence modern titles. At the same time, Sega's Genesis was aggressively competing with a more edgy image and campaigns like Genesis does what Nintendo don't. It worked, especially with older audiences. But the SNES won on depth. Its games were more ambitious, more polished, and more complete. For many, this was the peak of classic gaming. Nintendo 64. In 1996, Nintendo entered the 3D era with the Nintendo 64, and it delivered some of the most important games ever made. Super Mario 64 redefined movement and camera control in 3D space, while Ocarina of Time introduced systems still used today. GoldenEye set the standard for console shooters, and the analog stick became a permanent part of every controller. But at the same time, Nintendo made a decision that hurt them long-term. While competitors moved to CDs, Nintendo stayed with cartridges. They were faster and harder to pirate, but also expensive and limited in storage. That decision pushed major developers away. Square left and took Final Fantasy with them, along with others. The result was a console with incredible games, but a much smaller library. And yes, the controller had 3 prongs, which nobody was fully prepared for. Nintendo DS. In 2004, Nintendo released the DS, and at first glance it looked confusing. Two screens, a touchscreen, a microphone. It didn't look like a serious gaming device. It looked experimental. It went on to sell over 150 million units. The dual-screen setup allowed entirely new types of gameplay, from surgery simulations to puzzle games spanning both displays, while keeping maps and information constantly visible. More importantly, it expanded the audience. Games like Brain Age targeted older players, and Nintendo's introduced voice interaction. The DS reached people who had never considered gaming before. Sony's PSP had better hardware, but the DS had a broader audience and a massive game library. The hinge breaking was a common issue, but Nintendo quietly fixed it in later versions without making a big deal out of it. Nintendo Wii. In 2006, Nintendo once again ignored the industry's direction. The Wii was significantly weaker than the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, with no HD output and limited online capabilities. Most developers didn't take it seriously. It still sold over 100 million units. The reason was simple: motion controls. The Wii turned physical movement into gameplay. You didn't have to learn complex controls. You already knew how to move. Wii Sports made gaming accessible to everyone, from families to grandparents, and even hospitals used it for rehabilitation. Over time, the motion controls became repetitive, and many games failed to use them properly. Hardcore players moved on. But the Wii had already achieved something bigger by bringing entirely new audiences into gaming. Nintendo Switch. In 2017, Nintendo introduced the Switch, solving a problem that had existed for years. It combined a home console and a handheld into one device. On paper, it sounded like a compromise. In reality, it worked perfectly. You could dock it and play on your TV, then pick it up and continue instantly on the go. No interruptions, no separate systems. It launched with Breath of the Wild, a game so influential it sold the hardware on its own. Then came Mario Odyssey, Animal Crossing during a global pandemic, and a full generation of Pokemon titles. There were issues, especially Joy-Con drift, which led to lawsuits and was never fully solved. And technically, it can't compete with PlayStation or Xbox in terms of power. But those systems don't leave your house. The Switch does, and that flexibility changed how people play. Nintendo Switch 2. Now the next step is already forming. The Switch 2 is expected to build on the same hybrid concept rather than replacing it. Better performance, improved graphics, and more modern hardware are almost guaranteed. But if you expect Nintendo to suddenly compete on raw power, that's unlikely. That has never been their strategy. The real question isn't how strong it will be, but what they will do differently this time. Because history shows one thing very clearly. Whenever Nintendo follows the obvious path, things get predictable. And whenever they don't, things get interesting.